Everybody, welcome to the Frontline Club. My name is Millicent, I'm the programme editor here at the club. In a moment I'm going to hand you over to David Loyn, who's the BBC's Afghanistan correspondent, and he's going to be chairing tonight's discussion. Before I do that, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we are broadcasting live this evening. So over to David.
Thank you, Millicent. Thank you for being here on the night of the last episode of Wolf Hall. I should apologise on behalf of the Frontline Club for having an all-male panel. The only excuse is that 2 weeks ago there was an all-female panel, so it doesn't happen always. But it would be. I mean, I feel as if I live in Kabul most of the time, and I feel tonight as if I'm on a panel that the Taliban would approve of. Except for some of their occupations. Jack Fairweather, up down the end over here, currently based in Istanbul, going in and out of Iraq for Bloomberg, has written 2 first-class books on the recent campaigns, Iraq and Afghanistan. And in his Afghan book, which is entitled The Good War, he got away with irony in a book cover, which I think is a great achievement. Are you doing that in the US edition as well?
Even more surprisingly, yes.
At the far end, another excellent book that's recently come out. The 2 first-class books about Afghanistan recently come out. Mike Martin was a territorial soldier, went into Helmand, spoke Pashto unusually, and wrote a book initially with the support of the Ministry of Defence and then with the extraordinary capacity to shoot themselves in the foot that their soldiers don't have, but the Ministry of Defence Communications Department has proved over the last decade it's very good at. They tried to ban it, which immediately, of course, meant that how did that improve the sales? Could you proportionately?
It got to 37 on Amazon worldwide, which was very good of them.
So thanks very much to the Ministry of Defence. A book called An Intimate War, which is particularly about the Afghan campaign, and Mike was also the only person interviewed in Adam Curtis's recent film, A Bitter Lake, a rather extraordinary sort of art installation about Afghanistan. And he was interviewed because Adam Curtis believed, I think, that he would say something very particular, which he did, which we'll hear more of later on tonight. Major General Jonathan Shaw left the army 2 years ago and has written a far slimmer volume than the other 2 about strategic defence review. But in that he describes Iraq and Afghanistan both as disasters. Not, I think, what you would have said when you were in the army, or you would have been allowed to say.
I think I did, but in different words. As you do.
And on my right, Javed Nader, who is the director of the British Agencies for Afghanistan. Do I get the title right? BARG. Anyway, I've always known it as BARG, which is a coordinating body for NGOs operating in Afghanistan. Some of those NGOs have been operating like Afghan Aid going right back to the 1970s and 1980s. And Javed says that tonight he's here very much as an Afghan and wants to speak for himself. He's not necessarily representing the opinions of BARG, so he will be able to speak in a way perhaps more freely than he might otherwise have done. And what we're going to do in terms of lessons learned from the Afghan campaign, we could be here for several weeks. I want to go through what happened in Afghanistan since 9/11, up to today, up to particularly up to the departure of British and American troops at the end of last year. But beginning with 9/11, and Javed has a very particular story of exactly where you were. You were actually trying to flee Afghanistan at the time. Of course, the Taliban had been in control. What was it like for you, and how did you hear about 9/11?
Well, during the Taliban time, I was in Peshawar, and I graduated high school then. And then my brother and I thought there was no prospects for us in Pakistan or in Afghanistan. So we went to Iran, of course illegally, and then we were in the Turkish border when this 11th September attacks happened. At the beginning, we didn't know what to make of it. Later, we were upset that all these people are being killed. But then we also thought that, maybe Afghanistan is now becoming important for the international community. And then the security in the border got tightened, and we didn't make into Turkey. Also, Afghanistan changed in many ways. So we thought that it's time for us to come back. We did come back. And the first time I came back was 2002 in Kabul.
just going before that, did you think it was inevitable that there would be war on your country, that the Americans would go to war?
I think it was inevitable, and in some ways we really wanted that war to take place. Afghanistan was in war for many years before that, and we thought there will be no end to it. And then now a superpower was coming, and then we thought, it will be a decisive war.
Jonathan, did you think it was inevitable then? Was that the only thing? I mean, we can go into some of the mistakes that were made later, but in 2001 itself, was that the only thing the Americans could have done? As a
theoretically, they might have done it. They might have played the diplomatic card longer, and there are many of us that wish they had. But I think that all the feedback I got from that was that the political mood in America simply wouldn't tolerate anything but a vengeance mission.
Well, opinion polls in America at the time were 93% in favour of the action, and last month, for the first time, Gallup recorded a negative support for the war in Afghanistan. So that's how much it shifted in America. If I could go to Jack, after that, a general called McCall came into. I read in your book. I mean, he was very critical of what was going on. He was critical of the way that the troops. The decision was made by the Americans to pull troops out so quickly. What did he say? What did you pick up from your book?
Well, General McCall, a very sort of wise and sensible officer with a sort of rich experience in Northern Ireland, in the Balkans, saw Afghanistan as a sort of classic peacekeeping. He saw this young-ish, certainly very naive, inexperienced leader, Karzai, just installed on the throne, as it were, in Kabul, with really sort of no idea of how to pull levers of power as we see them in the West. How do you run a country? What institutions do you need? How do you channel money and aid in different places? And it's actually one of the sort of one of the first and big disjunctions in the war between the West's view of what the war was about and indeed what was actually going on the ground. Karzai was actually, during this period when he was meeting McCall, in the midst of very complex tribal negotiations to effectively put his henchmen in power across southern Afghanistan, which is the traditional way of ruling the country, because you want to control the opium in part, because you want to control those tribal levers of power. This was not necessarily appreciated at all in what Karzai was doing, and we took the first step in some ways towards greater military engagement. Not at first, but McCall raised this idea: we need more troops. We need to support Karzai.
What were the arguments about international troops, though? How did they play?
I mean, the US took actually, a very stripped down view of what should be done. Light footprint was the sort of catchphrase doing the rounds, but both in the UN and the US administration. And it was actually the Brits who played, through McCall, through some surrounding Blair, who played this role in saying, no, we need to have a broader engagement with Afghanistan, more of a nation building mission. And the US ignored them for a number of years, and then leading up to the next turning point in the war.
We'll come back to that in a moment. But the other thing that happened right at the beginning was what the World Bank described as an aid juggernaut descending on Afghanistan, of thousands of individuals who came from around the world. Now, you came back from Peshawar, Javed, and you started working in Afghanistan. Yeah. And in those early years, what were the relations like with the aid community when you were working for Afghan aid organizations?
Firstly, there were a lot of job opportunities, which I liked. I was only a high school graduate. When I came back, there was an opportunity to work for Swiss Peace Foundation part-time, and also part-time go to Kabul University. That was a great opportunity. So the aid agencies, they also wanted to do good. It was a country that was in drought for several years. Also, there were terrible poverty across Afghanistan. So aid agencies did come. With that also came a lot of hope. We obviously had fewer access to health care. We had shorter paved roads then, but a lot of hope among the Afghans. So aid community also, I think, responded positively to all this.
Well, given the fact that Afghanistan has had the equivalent of the Marshall Plan spent on it, we haven't got Germany. We've got Afghanistan, still a pretty poor country, and we'll talk a bit later about some of the mistakes that were made later. But in those early years, was it obvious that some of this aid was going astray, that it was going into the pocket, frankly, of corrupt warlords?
Not at the beginning, but later on we realized that it's not a Marshall Plan. A lot of money was spent through military. Probably that was not true to Germany or Japan. Also, before the war, Japan and Germany were relatively superpowers. Afghanistan was in a civil war for almost 20 years. So we knew that it's not going to happen overnight. It will require a lot of political will from the Afghan players, but also a lot of a political will from the international community. Now, when the Iraq war started, and I may be jumping a little ahead, we were very disappointed because then we realized that Afghanistan is not going to be a priority anymore.
And you thought the focus had moved on somewhere else?
We did, and
how did that manifest itself? I mean, did you say was there less money? Was there less attention?
Less money, less attention, less view that Afghanistan can be disarmed, that the warlords who are now ruling and then ruling, they will be not in power anymore. So they actually strengthened their positions inside the government, local government, also central. And it was then slowly Afghanistan moving towards disappointment. Security incidents also increased. The Taliban were able to regroup themselves. Pakistan, unfortunately, was playing a very different game. So yes, I evaded several suicide attacks during my stay in Kabul between 2002 and 2006.
Jonathan, could it have been different in those early years in terms of, we're hearing about warlords rearmed, a president put in who puts together his clients' support in the south, the opium trade. I mean, what was the international community doing? I mean, you were there planning in the Ministry of Defence.
I think the fundamental problem you're talking about there is, the question you're asking is, did we understand Afghanistan? And I think the real problem is we didn't. Still less did we understand Iraq when we went there either. And yet, as any Russian would tell you, what on earth are you Brits doing going back into Afghanistan when you made such a hash of it last time? And the ahistorical nature of our approach to both countries, I thought, was just remarkable. And I think it bedevils actually our entire foreign policy at the moment and our entire defence policy. The fact we simply don't understand what's going on. Our naivety about going into Libya recently, I think it just shows we haven't actually learnt these lessons at all. I think we went into Afghanistan and Iraq in denial of the lessons of history, launching ourselves on a sort of an American crusade, and I use that word advisedly, that I think was misguided. And I think we ignored the lessons of history that really we, of all people, should have known about.
Of course, there was this sense in 2002 and 2003 that America and Britain were going to war in Iraq. And I mean, did that... we've heard that there was a distraction, really. Iraq was a distraction. That's what it felt like from inside Afghanistan. But did that really make a difference to focus on policy in Whitehall?
Well, I think we took, in Afghanistan as later in Iraq, we took our lead from the United States. And I'm interested to hear that actually we're playing a different furrow, actually asking to stay there a bit longer. But certainly the American line on this, I mean, it's ironic given what Jack Keane said later on, but General Jack Keane, who at that time was a serving American officer, the deputy head of the American Army, he was giving the orders to people who went out to Afghanistan to give no impression of permanency, no impression of being there for the long term, no dependency. And that was his absolute statement. And years later, how he was then criticised the Brits for pulling out of Iraq so much faster, and his line. But at that time, that was very much the zeitgeist. In first, smash them, get out, and let them carry on with it.
Now, one of the things that there was this moment in the early years when different European countries said we will lead on various aspects of policy, and Tony Blair said we'll do narcotics. He put his hand up for narcotics, and it was one of the things that you were leading on. And last year, I think, was the largest ever crop in Afghanistan, the year that British troops withdrew. So good success there, General.
No, a complete failure, if not worse. Yeah, I mean, absolutely right. So the G8 carved up the country into various areas of responsibility, and Britain ended up with counter-narcotics. he in a paper that he read, he wrote at the top, "How the hell did we get responsibility for this?" Question mark. Good question for historians to go and study. But it was probably due to the fact that when the invasion happened in 2001, we were very successful in going in there and burning large stocks of heroin. And I think it probably comes down to some sort of agreement with the Treasury. Gordon Brown's height of, you do the contractual arrangements that departments had with the Treasury. You get rid of narcotics, I'll give you so much money. That sort of deal. It was very regrettable because. And I was sort of heading up the military effort to help the Foreign Office complete this task, was the inability of the executive machinery in Whitehall to deliver on a project of this scale and this complexity. They didn't understand the complexity of it. They couldn't coordinate not even coordinate, they couldn't direct all the organs of state to achieve the aim. The fact that DFID, who are the major part of the crop, the income replacement theory, they simply wouldn't tie into the government plan because of primary legislation that says that their activity must not be connected with government plans. I mean, it just exposed the whole inability of the UK government to come up with a coherent plan. And then you add the international aspect on it too. The American guys, I remember the guy from the American Drug Enforcement Agency called Doug Wankel, great name. The Americans had a completely different line on this. So not only could UK not get its shit together about counter narcotics, but the international community couldn't either. And it fundamentally came down to a point of not understanding the problem. People would say the problem with Afghanistan is its narcotics. I said no, the problem with UK is our addiction to narcotics. Afghanistan is actually 60% of its GDP comes from narcotics. Think what a shit state it would be in if it didn't have narcotics. So this is not their problem, it's our problem, and we're looking at it from the wrong end of the telescope.
I remember a Helmand poppy farmer telling me just exactly that. This is not our problem, it's your problem.
Absolutely.
If you want to buy this stuff. If you want to stop buying this stuff and stop your people from taking it. But then just moving on from there was then this political decision to move around the country. That there would be these so-called PRTs, provincial reconstruction teams, which would be military and political and aid. The Germans did the first in the north and they moved to the east. And then the British and the Canadians said they would move to the south. And now, Jack, I think Britain initially would have wanted to go to Kandahar. Helmand was a sort of historical accident.
That's right. It seems so bizarre to even contemplate the sort of conversations senior generals were having in which they were sort of dividing up which bit of the country they would come to the rescue of Afghans in. The planning team actually went to scope out what the Brits could do in southern Afghanistan. Were told by Ashraf Ghani, who had been the finance minister, if you go to southern Afghanistan, there will be a bloodbath. There is, you may have forgotten about Afghan history. Afghans have not. They still celebrate as a national day, kicking the Brits out of the country. Do not, whatever you do, don't go there. So, this was duly noted by the diplomat and, filed away in the report that was presented to Whitehall in December 2005. Actually, this planning team had done a degree of due diligence. They had actually gone to Helmand. In fact, the initial decision to go to Helmand was taken without any serious view of what was there at all. This team of about 3 went there. The main planner spent less than 3 days in Helmand, in which they saw the governor, and they concluded, well, we don't actually know that much about the place, but it's probably going to take a bit longer to find out. When this was raised in Whitehall in 2005, we need a bit more time. Margaret Aldred said, "What do you mean more time? We've been there for 5 years. Crack on." And that concluded the meeting. A month later, we were ploughing into Helmand.
It's a great quote in your book. I mean, I must say, I had been to Helmand before. I'd been during the Civil War, and it was the one place, I'd been during the Taliban years, it was the one place that they had even the Taliban had found it hard to control, and it was only right at the end of their time in power that they actually managed to secure it. The whole of the rest of the south of Afghanistan you could drive without any armed guards, but crossing Helmand you had to pick them up from all these local warlords, and this kind of intelligence didn't seem to percolate up to the Ministry of Defence, General.
Very quickly, I went there in 2005, in the summer of 2005, down to Helmand, and there were 150 American troops there, 50 in one place and 100 in the other. So tiny numbers of troops, they never had any trouble. They had huge amounts of aid that they were pumping in there. What the British did then was to put in huge amounts of soldiers and very little aid, and wondered why it upset the locals. But it was interesting that the Americans had very little trouble down there with very few troops, but a lot of aid, which the locals filched off them, obviously.
Yeah, the Americans live well as well. I went into that PRT with the very first British soldiers who were there. The first night I slept on the ground with British soldiers in Helmand, we had crayfish flown in at vast cost from somewhere in the Midwest. Now, but this aid that's coming in with the military is military aid, and there was a big debate in the aid community in those middle years about whether they could use aid, how they felt about this aid. I mean, this was not being delivered in any way that DFID or aid professionals such as yourself by then would have recognised. Is that right, Javed?
That is right. There were a lot of criticism about the militarization of aid. There was an issue that the Taliban or the ordinary people will not be able to identify who a military personnel is and who an aid agency personnel is. That posed security threats to aid agencies. That was one of the issues. The other issue was a lot of wastage of aid. The military personnel would push, in their management style of the aid delivery. They were quite stringent. There were strict deadlines. I remember there was a project of wheat seed distribution. Now, they wanted the wheat seed to be distributed at this given time. They didn't know that this variety of wheat seed is not suitable for this particular district of this particular province. So the contractors, what they did was they bought seed of wheat which later then farmers couldn't use, so they used as grains. So all that project, which was supposed to decrease opium cultivation, didn't do any good.
But can you blame the army for that?
I think I would blame the whole concept of winning hearts and minds through military intervention. I also remember other examples when there was a military group who went and distributed seed, but also took the biometric data of the farmers so that they could see if the farmers had any links with terrorists. Now, that's one of the examples. The other example is that they also then, terrible things, I would say. With the military, it was easier to do corruption. I know there was a friend of mine who worked as a translator for them. Later, he had a car exhibition, car show in Kabul, because what he would do, he would always put an extra zero with the invoices, and that earned him enormous fortune. There were other issues too. But I should also say here that we should not focus entirely on Helmand. That's the problem with the UK audience that I see here. Afghanistan is not Helmand only. And
I'm going to ask you to hold that thought, and we'll come back to Afghanistan in general, but I do want to do Helmand for 5 minutes. Sorry. Because we're at that sort of mid period, around about 2005-06. We've got them poised to go in. Apparently, the British Army think not bringing enough aid compared to the Americans. The aid community thinking actually aid would have militarized. If militarized aid had come in, that would have been a mistake. But then there was a war going on, and then the British went out to these different FOBs in the first year, the forward operating bases, and found themselves fighting a really, really tough campaign and taking a lot of casualties. And Mike, you describe in your book An Intimate War what that war was like, and what was really going on the ground.
Well, I think the first thing I'd say to the general, far be it from me to defend generals, so I don't normally do that, but you were set up to fail, because the government said you're doing counter-narcotics, and they said to another bit of the government, you're doing counter-insurgency. And the first is we're going to take people's livelihoods away, and the second is we're going to try and win your hearts and minds. So clearly those two policies are going to headbutt on the ground. So I don't feel too bad about that. The conflict in Helmand and I don't have a huge amount of experience of other districts in Afghanistan, but from what I've heard, Helmand seems to be a microcosm or a slightly extreme version of what happened elsewhere in Afghanistan. We, and this has been said before, but we completely misunderstood what was going on. Very broadly, we had a view of, and you've seen it exhibited in some of the panel members this evening, as a shorthand, we talk about the Taliban, who are sort of bad Islamic fundamentalists who throw acid in girls' faces. And on the other side, we have the government who are legitimate and we're supporting, and they're building schools and doing all this good stuff. We've spoken about aid. And that, I mean, everyone accepts that, you know, not all Taliban are one type and not all people in the government are one type, but we use it as a shorthand. The problem is that's not what is happening in most of rural Afghanistan. Certainly wasn't what was happening in Helmand. In Helmand, what you saw was a civil war that started, well, about 200 years ago, but really started in earnest in 1978 with the Communist Revolution, and then, you know, carried on through the 70s, through the Mujahideen era, fighting the Soviets and so on and so forth. And what you found is that when we tipped up in 2006 in the south, you had tribal leaders fighting drug lords, fighting militia commanders, fighting police commanders. It had nothing to do with the Taliban or the government, except that all those different groups had just picked sides on Monday, and on Tuesday they rearranged themselves on different sides. And so what that meant was, you know, all of the Helmandis understood that we understood the conflict as a dichotomous good, bad, government-Taliban conflict in essence. And what they did was they presented everything to us in that dichotomy. So when they came to us, you know, they manipulated us all day long. This happened to me many times. Someone would come to me and say, that bomb that went off today, it's these guys, very bad Taliban, go and deal with them. What they meant was, he killed my brother 20 years ago, and I'm using you to settle the score. And this happened all the time. And what that means is, whereas we went there to try and clamp down on the violence, and again, I only speak of Helmand, I only speak of the US and the British militaries, we made it worse. So rather than clamping down on the violence, we actually made it more violent.
Now, you got that when you were there, presumably. You reported it to your commanding officer. What did he say?
Well, yeah, so I worked as an advisor for 4 British generals in charge in Helmand, and I said that obviously my understanding developed as I spent more time working there, advising and researching. And I said that to all of them. And they all looked at me and went, and we had one-on-one, you know, as advisory sessions should be, one-on-one and private, and they all said to me, I know, but I'm stuck in this political framework. It starts with the Americans, it comes through Whitehall. In Helmand, we were a brigade operating under an American division. There's nothing I can do. What you're saying, I'm sure it's perfectly true. So at best, even with good knowledge, all we could do was slightly steer the policy. So a few less Afghans died, a few less British soldiers died, but really, you know, it just went on.
Jack, I mean, was there a real rethink? I mean, during those awful years, you know, 2006, 2007, Wootton Bassett years, as it were, when there were bodies coming back all the time, and there's a sense that there was no real improvement on the ground. You know, when you spoke to all those people for your book, your excellent book, what did they say to you about what was going on then?
There's the sort of military rethinking that goes on, which is often did very proudly by each brigadier as a sea change in the campaign. So that will mean, you know, 1 6-month tour, it's everyone out of their bases, and then next 6-month tour, it's everyone back in their bases. Next tour, it's, you know, everyone is going to be in the green zone. Next, it's patrolling in the desert. It's a sort of continuum of activity that doesn't much progress. There was, however, compared to the Brits in 05, 06, as they conceived of the UK's role in Helmand, as they sort of really led the war effort in many ways, because I mean this was still the time when the Americans were very much up against it in Iraq and had no real bandwidth for Afghanistan, and essentially outsourced the war to the Brits, to this sort of NATO command, which some Americans who had knowledge of the operations flagged and said, don't do it, Rumsfeld. Whatever you do, NATO, which had been a somewhat moribund organization since the end of the Cold War, don't hand stuff over to these guys. They can't do it. They've just never done an operation. By the time the Brits had 3 or 4 years there, and the Canadians and the Dutch, there was a sort of general recognition that they'd reached the end of their tether, that there was a limit to what they could do. They were holding the ring, and probably they should be scaling back. That was some of the thought. What then happened, of course, was this great sort of tsunami of military victory washed in from Iraq, where Petraeus had, the American general who had led the surge in Iraq, had sort of misread why he had quieted the war there. He thought it was because of a giant surge of US troops. That played a role, of course, but it was as much to do actually with Iraqis booting out insurgents. And it sort of tied in actually with some of John McCall's early thinking and this earlier criticism of the Afghan war. If only we'd had more troops sooner, we could have changed things. And then suddenly here with the Americans, oh yeah, we've done Iraq, we've got loads of troops. Let's plow in. And there was actually an entirely pivotal scene where, to answer Javed's question about why Helmand has become the focus, it wasn't purely British. I mean, the Americans also latched onto Helmand. There was a very crucial scene actually involving a US general and a British diplomat, where they completely changed the direction of the surge from the east and then from Kandahar straight to Helmand. And there's a lot of again, it's a repeat, because the Americans did as little due diligence over what they were getting in Helmand perhaps as we had done, and hugely militarized the war at the very moment the Brits were coming to a recognition that there were limits. And it's one of those ships passing. If the Brits had got their message across to the Americans and actually been a good ally and a real partner, and thrown some muscle in that relationship and not underestimated their sway.
I was in Helmand at the time. I was there pre-surge, during the surge, and post-surge. And the Americans came, and because it was just after Basra, they looked at us. And we said, actually, we're just getting to the point where we're starting to get to grips with...
Basra, brackets, for anyone who missed it, was a British military disaster.
Yeah. Which is why, one of the reasons why we went into Helmand was to prove to the Americans that we were still a credible military power.
Thanks.
And did you serve him, Basra General?
For another night. It's only, I was just explaining the shorthand. In Mike Martin's mind, for British military disaster.
Yeah,
Go on.
Exactly.
British
and
disaster.
one of the reasons we went into Helmand was to prove to the Americans that we could still do it. So come 2009, we've been there 3 years, we're starting to get there. We're actually being a bit subtle. We're sort of realising that actually that community, they're all Taliban because they've got a feud with the police who we're allied with. We're starting to get that level of subtlety. So instead of attacking them, we're leaking our plans so that they... And the Americans came in and we said, guys, we're onto something here. We've got something quite subtle and blah, blah, blah. And they went, piss off. And, rightly so, based on our experience, based on their experience of us in Basra, where they effectively had to come in and do some operations to clear out the sort of bad legacy that we'd left. If only, ironically, they had listened to us. What they did was when they came in 2009, they reset the clock back to 2006, where it was all good, bad, black, white government Taliban. And because we then came under their command in Helmand, whereas previously we were exercising an independent command, we reset ourselves back to good, bad, black, white, even to the extent that we produced a set of orders. One of the brigade commanders in particular, I remember, we produced a set of orders for our brigade, American Division. The only audience for that set of orders was the American divisional staff, to show that we saw the war in the way that they saw the war. We then issued a different set of orders verbally to our subordinate commands.
A senior general.
Can I intervene here? it reminds me of someone who said that human beings talk about the issues that they know about the most. I think Helmand is one of the areas you know more about the most. I should remind that Afghanistan is not just Helmand.
Okay.
We have spent more time on Helmand than on Afghanistan. This session could have been a Britain in Helmand session, not in Afghanistan.
I don't think that's fair. It's a British audience, and I'm sure they're really interested. And we're going to move on to the rest of Afghanistan. I just want to ask the General, because you've been taking notes and you've been listening to what's been going on. Just on sort of last word on Helmand in this section before questions.
Okay, so I'm going to say something quite controversial now, and that is that the British military were brilliantly successful at military stuff for the last 10, 12 years. Because the military are trained to kill people and break things, and we're bloody good at that, and we've done a lot of it.
Yeah, but it's like a doctor saying the operation was brilliant, but the patient died.
You're interrupting me. The problem is connecting the military instrument to the political objectives. The military were the wrong tool for the job. Where was the State Department leading it? Where was the Foreign Office plan leading it? Where was the political plan to actually achieve success that the military could have been supporting?
But Ed Butler's decisions to send out FOBs to different locations
it wasn't
a political decision.
Well.
It wasn't a political decision.
No, it wasn't, and it should have been.
Well, actually, that was in many ways that was coming from Karzai.
It came from Karzai. It was local politics.
That was a political decision because
it was a political decision.
We might be. I'm moving on to Javed's side.
So my point is that the military, the challenge. We've discussed what the military did, Actually, the military should have been in support of a political plan. Where was the political plan? When the McChrystal proposal came through in the autumn, whatever year it was, we discussed and sat around. Is this going to work? I said, hang on. Where's the political plan going to be knocked up that this is meant to be supporting? People said, oh, that'll be done in Bonn in March. I said it was too late. Intellectually, this is incoherent. It's the inability, it's the promotion of the military to be in the front as if the military were going to come up with an answer to Afghanistan. Afghanistan, after the original knockdown of the government, was all about creating a political entity in Afghanistan, not the military lead at all. The mistake was to put the military in charge for far too long, give it far too great a prominence. And it's a failure, I'm afraid, of the Foreign Office and the State Department and the political planners to come up with a coherent plan for us to support.
But I mean, just to add on to that, there were many political plans supporting the Afghan government in the way that we wanted the Afghan government to go. I mean, we told Karzai, look, the surge is a good idea. Karzai was against the surge. He told McChrystal, I don't think this is a good idea. We didn't listen to him. The political strategy wasn't for DFID and FCO to come up with. It was for the Afghans to come up with. And just to roll the conversation back before we leap forwards. In 2002, there was the aid conference, needed for the country. Everyone agrees that it was in a terrible state. Ashraf Ghani, the finance minister at the time, he had a simple request for money, $250 million to pay civil servants to keep the system of government going. Because Afghanistan was a country. It wasn't, even in its darkest days, it still incredibly had ministries functioning and some sort of veneer of civil service, which we should have built on. Instead, what happened? Ashraf Ghani stayed in his sort of lonely shell-riven bunker in Kabul. Everyone gathered in Tokyo in 2002, agreed almost $2 billion for Afghanistan, which would be given not to the Afghan government, but to aid agencies, who then spent most of it on creating a sort of aid bubble, which they've happily lived in ever since. We did not listen to Karzai, we did not listen to Ghani at every single junction of the war, and that's where the political strategy went wrong, and we should have listened.
We're now going to move on. Hold on. We're now going to move on to Javed. So what are we missing in the rest of the country? And when you, as an Afghan, look back from 2014 at the international aid effort, the international military effort, and then you look at a country as it is now, what do you think?
I think, as a young Afghan middle class, I would say I would review this more positively. I think as a result of your efforts in Helmand or in Afghanistan, I think it's also unfair to say that Britain was solely focused on DFID's money was helping Afghans in all parts of the country too. And then UK here hosted 8 development conferences many times in London. The point is here that there is a problem with the British public understanding. And that is that we compare Afghanistan with high standards of European standards, I believe. whereas Afghanistan should be compared with its regional countries and also understood in the right historic context. When we talk about Afghan elections, we say it's a failure. We don't see Tajikistan, which has had no democratic election for a long time. We don't see Pakistan, that still has problems with their past elections. We don't see Iran, for example. We compare Afghanistan with a Western developed country. When we talk about other things about Afghanistan, we look at a woman, for example, in Ghazi Stadium, she's playing football. I think the first thing that comes into British mind is, oh, that poor oppressed girl who's wearing a headscarf and playing football. They don't realize that a couple of years ago, 10 years ago, the same very place was used to prosecute women. So today Afghanistan has changed in three main ways, I believe. One is that Afghanistan is a better place to live. Second, Afghanistan is a more diverse, multicultural, intolerant. And third is that Afghanistan is more self-aware and self-critical. And by that I mean that look at the official figures, but also look at qualitative evidences. The lives of Afghan have improved. We have 7% more Afghan MPs in the lower house of parliament than in House of Commons here.
More women.
More women. Look at the demands of women, and then you could see today that how, where we are leading to. Afghan women are demanding at least 4 key positions in the cabinet and 1 position in the Supreme Court. And they are also adopting extraordinarily efficient tools to do that. Look at other positive changes. The constitution of new Afghanistan wanted Afghanistan to be a pluralistic society. That was actually enshrined in the constitution. Today we see it in the society. In all TV and radio shows, you see that. And also when I say that Afghanistan is more self-aware, I say that because we have unprecedented number of students in primary, secondary and higher education. Private universities in Afghanistan all over the country. So all these positive changes would have happened, would not have happened had you not gone to Afghanistan to topple a very draconian regime, Taliban.
You speak well. There was a recent Chatham House report which made exactly those points, written by a World Bank economist who'd been one of the most critical 10 years previously, saying that actually all of the quite optimistic projections of the Bonn conference had been achieved by last year. That you had an economy that had averaged around 9% growth. It's less than that, far less than that now. And all of these other improvements
but that's
have come
90%
from aid for all the reasons that we described. Let's take some questions. Have we got a microphone? I'm going to favour a woman at least, because we've heard only over here. But I will come to you, sir. Just to hear a voice.
Thank you. My name's Barbara Stapleton. I was based in Kabul from 2002 to 2010, and then back in 2011 3 times. Just with the references to McCall and having more troops in the early years, I think you need to nuance that a little more carefully. What you're referencing is the UN-mandated peacekeeping forces to establish security that it was envisaged, whether it would have worked or not, by the Afghans more than anybody else, could be a block to the growing power of the warlords, the predations of illegal armed groups, etc., who were then able to re-strengthen essentially unopposed. As the door closed on the expansion of ISAF in 2002, the PRT plan was launched in November 2002, essentially as a compromise, and non-US NATO member states' forces were not going to expand peacekeeping forces as the US pulled out critical air support by mid-2002. That process had already started to go to Iraq. So US military forces who were dependent on that air support for medevac, etc., then could not, the question of expanding ISAF was dead in the water. It's also incorrect, I would comment as well, that the 2002 Tokyo Donors Conference funds went to aid agencies, if we're talking about non-profit professional aid agencies, who have been living in a bubble ever since. From 2002 to 2005, I coordinated policy and advocacy for ACBAR, which was the main coordination body for NGOs based in Afghanistan. And I can tell you that the funding situation went from a desperate, in 2001, concern about the effects of the drought, and even funding for mines being removed, ending, and wondering what the hell was going to happen in Afghanistan, to the extraordinary green light that happened from 2002. But the lack of understanding of the situation in Afghanistan in January 2002 meant that funds earmarked for development had to be diverted to the ongoing humanitarian crisis that had been caused by the preceding 4 years of drought. I think it's careful that we get our facts right on
Jack,
this.
I don't know if you want to comment on any of
Yeah,
that.
I would actually. I think the fundamental problem with McColl's idea about a peacekeeping force, which arose from conversations with Karzai in December 2001, was that if you put 25,000 troops that was being discussed into towns around Afghanistan, what then? In actual fact, there wasn't a security vacuum in these towns like Kandahar, like in Lashkar, in Helmand. It was a very concerted effort to establish law. There was some tribal settling going on, but there were also shuras springing up. By inserting a military force which knows nothing about the terrain in which it's going, you would simply be bringing forward the disaster that subsequently happened. Putting 5,000 British troops into Helmand or Kandahar in 2002 would not have made a difference to the long-term trajectory. If anything, it may have made it worse, because, you know, frankly, British troops in Afghanistan, in southern Afghanistan, is not a mix that works. It's going to lead to more violence. And, you know, I would suggest that the war itself is empirical evidence of putting more troops, more weapons, more guns into the civil war that was raging for 30 years. So I think there was a misconception there, reading our experiences of the Balkans into what Afghanistan needed at that time, and underestimating the strength and the resilience of Afghan society to respond to warlords, to respond to predation. Not saying that there shouldn't have been some support, of course. As for the money that went to Ashraf Ghani, he told me himself that he had enough in 2002, 2003. In fact, he was so concerned about the influx of aid agencies that he sought to block UN diplomats from coming into the country. He knew exactly what was coming. He too had studied, history. He was one of the numbers of a member of the World Bank who had written a hugely critical report of the dangers of excessive Western funding and development projects in countries. In fact, Afghanistan had at its centerpiece one of the greatest disasters in aid history, which was the attempt to build Kajaki Dam, which led, to dam the river in the 60s as part of the Cold War, which led to the complete tribal mess that was in Helmand and a huge opium industry, because the only thing that the badly dammed and irrigated land could grow was poppy. That was the background by which he said, no, let's not come in with grand schemes. There is a place for projects, for infrastructure. As Jawed pointed out, the country needed a lot, but it needed to come from the Afghans. And, it was slower, less perfect, not so grand, didn't meet donors' objectives, didn't look great in the UN glossy brochure about their achievements, but it would have been something more authentic. And all those successes that Javed's mentioned, and which I think is worth definitely underscoring. Afghanistan, I'm sure David would attest, is much better. It's a different country to it was in the early years. But a lot of those changes, beyond removing the Taliban, came about through the Afghans, getting kids into schools, the creation of the vibrant self-criticalness that Jawed talked about. That came about through Afghans doing it, not through donors' conferences and sending troops into Afghan towns of which they knew little.
There's one there, and then we'll come down here.
if we're trying, I think if we're trying to say what worked and what didn't, we simply have to mention the civilian and other casualty figures in Afghanistan. Those increased by about 22% last year. UNAMA, since they started counting in 2009, I think have recorded about 17,000 civilian deaths in this war. Last year, I think about 700 children died, and with every death, there are huge implications. Every family that loses a breadwinner, children will be taken out of school, etc. So I would agree there are gains, but I think we have to mention the level of casualties that have occurred over time, and also the level of internal displacement and refugee flows. I think there's about 800,000 people displaced within Afghanistan now, largely, well, I don't know to what extent, but largely caused by the conflict. So I just want to make a very quick comment, I'm sorry, but on the nature of the assistance effort to the building of Afghan government institutions, to say that it abandoned a lot of the principles of good aid delivery. I think we've said that already. It was extremely fragmented, the whole PRT model, multiple projects. It was extraordinarily difficult for those members of the Afghan government that were well-intentioned to use this assistance to implement policy reform and strengthen the levers of the state. They could barely comprehend the numbers of individual donor projects. They spent their time engaging with donors rather than their own people to strengthen the social contract fundamentally. And basic systems, including civil service systems, just weren't built. And the level of aid at one point was equivalent to GDP. This is simply not sustainable. It created a dependency, and there's a huge fiscal challenge now for Afghanistan. And I think that the level of military intrusion into some of the state-building processes, particularly the development of the police force and the Ministry of Interior, has consequences which Afghans are still paying the cost for. So I do have a couple of questions, one of which is to Javed. Can you comment in this kind of fiscal crunch that Afghanistan's in? Which public services can it afford to keep the lights on for the schools, the hospitals, given the nature of its dependency and the vast sums which were spent without real thought of sustainability for the future? And a second question, given those horrendous human costs last year, which surged last year, and a form of warfare which is increasingly perhaps a little more civil war-like, you have a lot more ground engagement between the anti-government elements and the government, part of the reason for this surge. Do you have any hope that the current movements with regard to the conflict, that China is now sort of becoming involved into a strategic role, Pakistan's attitude may be changing, and Ghani is perhaps trying to be more transparent on this peace process? Do you have some hope that this violence might perhaps come to an end?
Javed.
Very good point. Now, when I counted the achievements, I wanted to do so to tell everybody that Afghanistan was not a lost war. It was not a lost cause. It created a lot of positives for the Afghanistan people as a whole. But we should not underestimate the problems that's still there. Civilian casualties is one of the greatest. I, as an Afghan, but also as a human being, actually, I'm deeply saddened that such a thing happened. It has happened to very close friends of mine. Last year, when I was in Kabul, the suicide attack that targeted Shukriya Barakzai, an MP, actually I was in less than a few hundred meters away from it. Today I don't know whether the taxi driver that dropped me survived that attack or not. So let's also see who are doing these civilian casualties. The report also says that more than 70% of that is because of Taliban activities, that they are directly responsible for this. And also let's look at the civilian casualties that were during the Taliban time. If the Taliban had existed, we would have had a civil war. In fact, massacres could have continued in Afghanistan. So that's one of the points. The other point is that all the international military, the Afghan forces, they should protect the civilians. They should do that. There is no compromise over that. Today, in Helmand, there is a big operation, probably the biggest military operation of Afghan army going on, called Zulfiqar. The reason it's slow, they say, is that they want to protect civilians. That's very positive. On the fiscal,
yes, I was going to say on the question of, so can they afford to keep the lights on? How's that going to go?
I think that's a historical question, really. Look at the Afghan history from the past 300 years. We have always depended on some external resources. Afghanistan is a very rough terrain. 300 years ago, we went, with the power of sword to India and took the resources to feed ourselves. And then when more sophisticated power,
Yeah, but aren't they going to have to learn to fend for themselves?
That's the thing. There is an opportunity now. I think the mines is an opportunity. It's a long-term opportunity. It can be a resource curse too, but that opportunity exists there. So, and also the efforts of Ashraf Ghani and the others to make Afghanistan he says, roundabout of Central Asia. I don't know what that means, but a place where, we can benefit from the trade. That's an opportunity as well. So with that comes also the issue of
but
peace.
Afghan businessmen, hold on. need to do business in Afghanistan.
They do.
You need to provide institutions.
I think one of the institutions that could be improved and our revenue could be collected more effectively is the custom and the taxes. So efforts are ongoing. I think that's also one of the powerful areas of Ashraf Ghani. He is putting a lot of effort.
Do you know, just put you on the spot, do you know very specifically what priorities the government has? Because they clearly have got some very big challenges over what to spend the money on in the near future.
One of the priorities is peace. The other one is revenue collection. And the revenue collection, corruption efforts plays a major role. You might be aware that 3 weeks ago, the Afghan Ministry of Defense stopped one of their contracts, big contracts, because of the corruption. The people who are involved, both government officials and the businessmen, they are not allowed to leave Afghanistan until that matter is solved. I think that's a very positive signal to everyone in Afghanistan. On the matter of peace efforts, I should say that it's one of the good opportunities. We should not put all our expectations and hope in that at the moment. We don't know yet. We only know that the Taliban chief Mullah Omar has agreed that his representatives talk to the Afghan government in Qatar and also with the Americans. We also know that Pakistan and other regional countries that didn't believe Karzai, they are starting to believe Ashraf Ghani. After all, Ashraf Ghani has stopped his request to get heavy weapons from India. He's also, for the first time, sending Afghan soldiers to Pakistan to be trained. So that trust is there. But peace efforts in Afghanistan is going to be a long process. And then IS-like warriors, now some of them have emerged. Now, as we talk, there are 30 Hazara Shias that are kidnapped by the IS-like insurgents in Afghanistan. And I pray and hope the Taliban, the IS, don't do to them what they did to Christians in Libya. They will probably don't listen to Mullah Omar. No. So some level of violence will continue, even if this peace talk bears fruit.
Mike.
I mean, it's the same stuff again, isn't it? It's ideology. It's IS is the new ideological movement, and they're coming in. So just go back to what you were saying earlier. You're talking about peace. You spoke about Mullah Omar. Who are the Taliban?
Well, Taliban are it's a mixed group. But we have some mainstream Taliban, the people who listen to Mullah Omar and the Quetta Shura, as they term it. We have evolved Taliban as well, who are based in Kabul and who actually have a university. We always thought Taliban will not allow education, but in this university, women who do not wear very traditionally, acceptable clothes like Taliban do, they go and study. Yesterday, a Taliban was being interviewed by a women journalist who was talking about this whole process. So I think the mainstream Taliban they have shown some interest in the peace process, and this is promising. But there will be IS-type, younger generation people who have extremely different interpretations of Islam who will continue to some level.
But I think Mike's point is there are plenty of people on the ground in Afghanistan who, inverted commas, fly under the Taliban flag, who have nothing to do with IS.
It's very useful when you're on one side of the argument to define your opponents as unitary. I mean, we see this in every time in UK politics when we're having this election. If you define your opponents as something definable and unitary, then you can attack them. So, in Afghanistan, of course, all those people who are fighting for whatever reason the anti-government fighters like to define their enemy as kafirs and unbelievers and so on and so forth, puppets of Bush in America. And in the same way, many on the other side of the argument, the Western interveners, the aid community, the government in Afghanistan like to define the enemy as, you know, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, IS, whatever. But that's not very helpful. And the problem is, you know, you can talk to Mullah Omar. Mullah Omar can come and live in the ARG, the presidential palace in Kabul, and they can, you know, he can become the vice president. How does that stop Ahmed pulling a trigger in Kandahar? Because the reason he's fighting is because the police have stolen his land 10 years ago.
How could you stop someone called Abdullah Budojo? What was the name of that person who killed one British military here in the heart of London?
Well,
you can never stop individuals to do things.
Well, we're drifting away from the first hand to be raised. So let's go back into to focus on Afghanistan.
Thank you all. The name's Ewan Grant, former UK Customs Intelligence Analyst, recently returned from rather extended trip to Pakistan on customs and border control reform, where there were some tentative signs of positive developments. I had to change hotels during the Afghan president's visit, which did have some, the body language was quite good there. Question one for Javid: which international aid NGOs do you feel did well and which didn't? And secondly, in terms of longer term political military programs and challenges for the West, why aren't Jonathan Shaw's comments, all his comments tonight, made compulsory reading for every international organisation? Because from my time working in the ex-Soviet countries, particularly Ukraine, I have seen comparable utter ignorance. Thankfully, generally not from British people, but from international organisations, and it's diabolical. It's got to be raised much higher.
Thank you, Ewan. And I should say, if you do get the microphone, if you could just say who you are, that's always useful. And at the back next, but Javed. So which NGOs are any good?
I think the international NGOs that worked with the Afghan people, consulted them in their project design.
Which one?
Well, I can give you examples of BOG members, definitely. Afghan Aid is one of them, but there are plenty of others that didn't have a lot of overhead costs. They did plan things with the Afghans, and they in their implementation of those projects, they also involved the communities. And there is a high degree of ownership in those projects in rural areas. I think they did work well. And I should also share with you a personal story. I was heading Afghanistan Land Authority between 2009 and 2011. I had around 156 staff in Kabul, and then around 850 overall in Afghanistan. And we were tasked with the enormous task of administrating public and private land in rural areas. There was a problem. The problem was that out of around 1,000 employees that I had, only 4 of them had a bachelor's degree. And none of these permanent employees of civil service knew how to operate a computer. Now, you cannot run a public service with such level of capacity. This capacity will require long-term investment on the human resources. Now, you cannot wait when you have orphans, when you have widows who are starving, you cannot wait for that capacity to be built.
14 years later, your organisations have not provided the education to replace that.
I can tell you that some level of success that has happened. Look at the civil service today in Afghanistan. I should be proud of myself when I say that in the Asia Foundation survey that surveyed around 8,000 people, last year, Afghanistan Land Authority was one of the most trusted institutions in Afghanistan. The most trusted institution in Afghanistan. It was because we recruited a lot of young people who studied outside Afghanistan and who are ready to serve Afghans. Now, the point about international organizations, precisely the same thing. you are dealing with a house that's both burning, but also require foundations. You have to fight water water is good for extinguishing fire, isn't it? So you have to find water, but also in the meantime build that. I'm saying what Ashraf Ghani said actually in a recent interview, but I had also said that earlier, much earlier. You have
He stole it from you.
We agree on that matter. You have to do emergency, and I think international aid agencies, and I agree with Barbara here, the ones that were professional aid agencies, they did an extraordinary work. Unfortunately, the military that used some contractors in Afghanistan, they defamed aid agencies to a large extent.
Yeah, I think when criticism is made of international organisations, it's not Afghan aid that they're talking about, it's the UN organisations, and particularly the organisations financed by the Americans like Louis Berger, the people who were building the roads, etc.
Exactly,
But those are the people wasting the money.
I'd like to add a little point. I mean, the Afghan government and the most recent sort of assessments by US auditors of how money was spent suggest that over half, maybe as much as 80% of aid money spent in Afghanistan did not go to its intended recipients. However, there was one program, despite this extraordinary level of corruption that was brought in some ways by the US, by aid agencies. I mean, inadvertently in some cases. Also, there's a large story, little cases that pop up in the US media where you read about some guy who's being charged with defrauding X amount of money. There was one program that actually had very little corruption. It was run by Ashraf Ghani, which is one reason to have some hope that this cash crunch that you mentioned may be navigated, because he actually had one of the few programs that worked in the early years called the National Solidarity Program, which was just a very simple idea, and it didn't take computers or vast amounts of skill. It just involved telling villagers, look, here's $5,000. We're not going to give it to a headman. We're not going to give it to one tribe or the other. Form a shura, decide what you want to spend the money on, and then we'll give it to you. And this is a village program which, sadly was underfunded despite Ashraf Ghani's best efforts in those early years, and was not rolled out fast enough into the areas where it could have made a difference, and was largely neglected, of course, by the PRT program, which was this military-run program we've discussed that's subsumed it all. Just one other, the economy, and I'll put it out to the audience. The major source of revenue in the country is opium, other than aid money. To have neglected utilizing that vast industry worth over 4 billion, probably even more since I last checked the figures, given the bumper crop this year, and to force it into the black market, to criminalize effectively the only means of revenue, seems to me completely insane. It was insane throughout, and led to the most bizarre policy I think I've ever witnessed, even in Iraq, with Doug Wankel, who we mentioned earlier, in fields with sticks, a bunch of US contractors whacking down poppy sticks, livelihoods. I mean, in a nutshell, there is the sort of madness of the war. And back in 2001, I would love to hear Jonathan's views in due course. There was a debate about how to deal with opium. There were great examples from Turkey, from Southeast Asia, that you could legalize the crop. Did we do it? No. Canada and Australia, who had the largest morphine markets in the world, said no, and the US didn't want to potentially subsidize an opium crop if it couldn't reach the market rate. Anyway, that's just a
I read the passionate desire for legalizing opium in your book at the back.
Managed to steal the microphone, so Hassan Damaluji from the Gates Foundation. My question's already been asked, which was what were the good examples? So instead of asking it, I just wanted to make a quick statement in support of, or sort of around that question, which was that, just pause for a minute on what Javed said when he had the opportunity to just speak, not in response to a sort of what was good, what was bad, or why was it all wasted. Actually, GDP went up, healthcare was better, I can't remember exactly what statistics, I'm sure there are fewer children dying every year, more people in school. the economy grew. So, oh well, that was all because of aid. Well, wasn't that part of the point? And the point I'm trying to make is not that there weren't lots of mistakes, but a little bit of a defense of the aid sector, a little bit like the defense of the military that the general gave, which is that you need political direction in order for any tool to be used effectively. I think aid's difficult, development's difficult. You know, we've heard different explanations of what should have been done, but then someone else somewhere has said why that wouldn't have worked or didn't work. So, for example, it should have all been done by the Afghan government. Well, actually, no, because it was all lost in corruption if it was done that way. You should have NGOs with low overheads, but it's terrible if you don't have enough staff who have qualifications and not enough computers. So, do you want high overheads, low overhead? You know, it's just not easy work. And so, I think one of the things that was going on in Afghanistan is that too much aid money went. So you're trying to crack a nut with a sledgehammer. And that's what happens when the world turns its attention to something like Haiti or like the Philippines. Suddenly there's a rush of money, no more things to buy. And so the price of a Land Rover goes up and the price and it ends up leaking. But those were political decisions, not the aid agencies. They were given that money and told to do a good job. And everything I hear from Javed is broadly supportive of the work they did. I think there's a political narrative we have that aid is bad, that is very strong in this country, that maybe we need to question how much we're buying into that and how much we really have evidence for whether it was bad. So just to finish, is, you know, as a private foundation, we had the luxury of saying, right, there's too much money going over there, and so we haven't really spent much in Afghanistan. But as a government aid agency, that was a political decision they had to work with. So that's
we're running out of time. I'm not going to put that to the panel. It's a well-made statement. I'm just going to take two questions here. One at the front, and then you, and we'll answer those two, and then you.
Jim Maceda, former, I should say, NBC News foreign
Jim, it's
correspondent.
good to see you.
Good to see you, sir. Being American, I don't think I'm going to take on you five gentlemen because I don't like the odds. But I do want to ask this, and I'll make my question really, really quick. The problem with this war, of course, is that there wasn't one war that has lasted 14 years. There's been really 5 wars that have been about 2 or 3 years each. Without going into great detail, if you just think for a second about how it started with a counter-terrorism operation, CIA-driven, and how it morphed so many times into kind of this limbo war forgotten in the early 2000s, and then the counterinsurgency eventually. There was a period of time where kinetic was, I can remember talking to General at the time, Colonel Nicholson, telling me, we're going to kill or capture every single Taliban we can. And then 3 or 4 years later, the same general then telling me, we can't kill or capture our way out of this war. Same guy. So let's say there are, and now today you've got this policing, from an American military point of view, a training mission. I want you guys, if you can, the 5 of you, to just give us a sense what you think. Pull out your crystal balls and give us an idea of what you think, where you think the war from, let's say, 2014 to 16 or 17 is going to go. Is it going to be 10,000 Americans walking around patrolling the streets of towns and mountains, or is it going to be something very, very different? Do you see a breakthrough at all?
It's a very good link into, as it were, the sort of last part of the evening. I'm just going to take this question here.
Oh, hi.
Hello.
Brittany Golub, editor of Communicate magazine. You guys all kind of talked about how the British military particularly was put into a difficult situation at the beginning of the war. So now that we're kind of at the end of that era, what are, in terms of the lessons that we learned from Afghanistan, what are some of the things that we maybe should have done, or what are some of the lessons that the British military can take forward into a similar situation in future?
Can we do that in sort of 1.5 minutes each along the panel? Okay, so lessons learned for the British military, and what's the war going to look like for the international military in a couple of years' time, Mike?
So lessons learned for the British military. I mean, I would always argue that you need less of a technical solution and more of a soft skills solution. So more people with languages, more people who understand history, culture, that sort of thing. It's likely that the UK is going to be intervening in places like Afghanistan, so we need to have those soft skills rather than Typhoon jets. David Cameron has recently announced a 1% increase in the equipment budget, so it appears that lesson hasn't to him. Where are we going to go in the future? I suspect at some point during the next presidency in America, you'll have a president who is untainted by association with Afghanistan. They will then trim everything back to the bone, and the Chinese will end up owning it.
Two quick thoughts, Javed.
Prediction about Afghanistan is very difficult, especially if it's about future. But then I can tell you
2020 hindsight has been very prominent tonight. You know that we would have known. Go on.
I think from what we hear from the politicians and see in the ground, Afghan army will take lead in the operations. They have already taken lead. They will do what they are doing, for example, in Helmand at the moment, doing the Zulfiqar operation. Some major urban areas will continue to be threatened by the Taliban, infiltrated actually. Suicide attacks are not going to go away from Afghanistan in very soon future. But I believe and I hope that the international community will continue to train Afghan forces and also equip them, support them, especially in the intelligence and through air. What interesting thing that recently came up was that Pakistan and Afghan forces are for the first time going to have joint operations in the border areas. That infuriated Hamid Karzai actually. He issued his first statement as the former president of Afghanistan, thinking that it was going to threaten our territorial integrity. But this is a positive development. For the first time, that's going to take place. So some kind of regional consensus will be there on the war against Taliban in Afghanistan.
Jonathan,
very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, but particularly lessons learned. British Army. I mean, the British Army is doing a lessons learned. Do you think they will learn lessons?
Okay, I'm going to twist it. I'm going to say the lessons are yes for the British Army, but they're fundamentally tactical ones. I think the most important lessons are ones for the government, because I think this was more a government failure than it was just a single department's failure. The first lesson is understand the nature of the war you're fighting. We failed to do that then, we failed to do it in Iraq, we failed to do it in Libya, we failed to do it against ISIS. I think we're failing to do it with Putin as well. Second point, it's a failure of government. When we were trying to do something, we have this marvellous thing called a comprehensive approach. What we don't have is a mechanism in Whitehall to create a comprehensive plan. An approach means disjointed activity that's all jolly well meaning, but isn't coherent, isn't tied together, doesn't actually make a plan. As long as we don't have that, we will continue to fail. Evidence of that, look at the House of Commons Defence Committee's report on recent activity in ISIS. You know, Cameron saying we'll put our full might of the military in campaigning this. What do? 6 planes out there, only 2 flying at any one time. Pathetic. You know, we just simply can't do it. Point 3, I think it's a failure of our political class. Our political class now are more interested in bodying politicians than they are in actually doing stuff. They've got a complete deficit and a growing deficit in actually executive experience and executive competence. So you've got politicians and civil servants, both effectively just policy wonks, no idea of the white world, that little Whitehall bubble, awful, can't do stuff. And why is that worrying? Because the current war we're about to face is against Putin. I would say that interest seems to Braithwaite over there. Ambassador, I'd love to hear your views. But it does seem to me that when you're faced with an opponent like Putin, who has an accepted doctrine called hybrid warfare, which is how to coordinate from a central government point of view every lever of state power to economic, diplomatic, corruption, cyber, whatever, and a tiny bit of military. They've got that mechanism, we haven't, because we have a failure in our political class, we have a failure in our political machine, and we couldn't organise a piss-up in a brewery. Full stop. Okay.
Do you need to add, Jad? Sorry, I think Jack. I think I asked him to talk about the British. I mean, Jack. I mean, Afghanistan in 2 years' time.
You know, there's a saying that's sometimes attributed to Winston Churchill that the Americans always hit upon the right solution after exhausting every other option. And it seems after about 13 years, you know, there is a strategy of containment support for the Afghan military that will hold major cities in Afghanistan for the foreseeable. Places like Helmand are up for grabs and probably won't be held. So that's that's the vision for the future. I think the danger is with a containment strategy is that you sort of neglect the diplomacy, the sort of overt, open means of engagement, of bringing sides together. Obviously, the Obama administration has completely turned its back on the Afghan war, despite it being the good one, as Obama claimed, and completely botched efforts that they should have learned from and developed going forwards in terms of in terms of peace talks. As for the military, from speaking to quite a lot of officers over the last few years, I think it seems to me that the military leadership has come to reflect the political class, incredibly short-term strategies, and wars of countries aren't going to work. Which was put to Richard Dannett, why don't we adopt an American system of a year-long deployment? He said that we're getting in the way of training. Training, of course, meaning driving around Salisbury Plain in armoured vehicles maybe he was ahead of his time. If Putin does invade Western Europe, we will be well prepared, but we won't be well prepared for these long, complex wars that require, language skills, require a whole different way of thinking about careers in the military, how we, indeed, in the UK, think about how we engage with the West. Long, steady engagement with real skills built up. But that's not the way it's going to go.
Can I say I disagree with you about Helmand? I was there 3 times last year, and one of them for the second round of the elections, completely outside the British wire. And of course, there's a huge amount of police there at the time, but relative stability doesn't. I mean, it's a transformed place.
That's because
Nad Ali. Well, that's true. No, that's true. But he said it would be handed back to the Taliban, and so I disagree with you about. I think and I think the opportunity. Well, we'll come back to that. But let me just make this point: the opportunity for. If it does, Afghanistan's big problem is the state actually taking the opportunities that it's got. You have very good roads, you have schools and hospitals that are far better than they were. You have the central populated zone of Helmand is broadly secure. The former British base in Nad Ali, where I was for the election, is now a cricket pitch. You have a real sense of farmers doing different things, draining this damaged land for the first time in 30 years, of a society that wants something different. People having poetry festivals and rock concerts, and young people, including young women who speak good English, going to universities in Kabul from ordinary Helmandi families. It wasn't all a total disaster, and I don't think it's going to be handed back to the Taliban. I don't think the government's going to let it happen. And it's very easy to say that everything's going to go bad in Afghanistan. The last panel I chaired at the Frontline Club 4 years ago, people said the Taliban would have taken over by now, the whole country. It's always very easy to say bad things are going to happen, and harder to put your hand up and say it'll probably be just about all right, which is the...
It's true, although as was pointed out, civilian casualties in Helmand are the highest they've ever been.
That's because
towns like Sangin and Helmand in the north are...
Because the Afghan forces, competent though they are, don't have the same desire not to kill civilians.
I'm not sort of celebrate. I'm not sort of It's not a happy vision, but
there's hands all over the place. I'm going to take 3. You, sir, where's at the front? Who's got the microphone? And then Dominic, and then you, and here. Yeah, Dom. Yeah, it is Dom. No, it's not. Forgive me. No, but first the woman here, sorry.
Hi, thank you. Małgorzata Skowrońska, a graduate from King's College London. My question is, do you think that international community or the Western community have a problem with expecting quick fixes in difficult places? Like, let's be realistic here. We've been in Afghanistan 14, 15 years, and we want to have a democracy, free elections, brilliant economy, no Talibans. I'm myself from Poland. It took quite a long time for us to get to the point where we are. And we're talking about Afghanistan, who've been in the war for the last 40 years. It's not going to happen over the night. It's not going to happen over 14 years. I think maybe we all need a bit of patience. And this implies being in Afghanistan. Because when the international community sort of loses the interest in the country, then the politicians start to pull out resources, pull out the military, because there's no interest. So it's actually to all of us, are we still interested in Afghanistan? Are we going to be interested in 10 years' time in Afghanistan?
Behind you. Yeah.
Malcolm Deal-Jobe, Scots Guards. Far be it for me to comment on political level issues and the application of democracy in a culture that is largely tribal and feudal. So I'm going to stick to the military tactical level and ask again a question I asked Roy Stewart in March 2009, and I'll give you his answers first to cover them. And this has been touched on by General Shaw and by Jack, and it's about short-termism. And this is military short-termism and the 6-month tour that we've been sticking to. And it's topical with the naming last month of 77 Brigade, and they've yet to establish their doctrine, so we're not sure where they're going to be going with this, but I
this is this IT organisation that would play hybrid warfare.
It's a bit more, it's information people. It's quite broad, but it's been banded around, and they're not the Chindits, and they're not special forces, but the political officer of old, and whether that is the way forward. I think it may be something somewhere that they will be going towards at 77 Brigade, and whether that is the answer we should have had in Afghanistan, more long-term. Low level.
What was Rory Stewart's answer on
his answers were the political officer would not work because in 2009 political reluctance in terms of establishing a longer tour for anyone, and there are 9 long-term established posts in Task Force Helmand, but also military reluctance that people wouldn't be willing to step up to the post, and I disagree with both.
And just one here. And then I think we'll just run along the panel as just to finish off because we're close to
David Page, Small Wars Journal. I'm also a British. Personally, I don't think we will be giving any money to Afghanistan in 10 to 20 years, and I think the people who will leave first will be the Americans. But my question is not about Afghanistan, is to draw back from Afghanistan and look at it. We went primarily to Afghanistan with the Americans because the Americans wanted to go. The irony is, and it's not something popular in the United Kingdom, is in actual fact the Americans now don't want to go anywhere with us because we are neither capable nor willing to either wage war or do politics. And I think it's a sad reflection of our longest Afghan war that we've ended up in a strategic position where our key ally doesn't want us anymore.
That was the final question. I just want to sort of round up along the panel. So, I mean, Mike, is it really that bad? And perhaps some of these short-termism questions?
Well, I think, so I agree with you. In terms of short-termism, yeah, of course I agree with that as well. We were trying to compress 40 years into 6 months. Political officers, right. So I set up for the MOD the role of the cultural advisor, which was based on the political officers of old. We get officers, we teach them the language, we give them a little bit of anthropology and social science methodology, and then we send them out there. And the job of a cultural advisor or a political officer is to build relationships with Helmandi, in this case, notables, and then exploit those relationships for influence, i.e. to influence them or to understand their society. So it's interesting that Rory Stewart said that in 2009 because that was when we set it up, so he probably wasn't aware of what was going on. And when he spoke about long tour lengths, I went out on one of those long tours that they set up in order to make that role happen. So it did happen. It was appallingly resourced by the MOD. I was charged with setting it up in Helmand. I rang up London and I said, I need officers who speak Pushtu, please. And they said, we've got some Dari speakers, is that okay? But we got there, and it did have a discernible effect. We had 1 per battalion, and then 1 sitting up a brigade. I would have liked to have had 1 per company, so 3 or 4 or 5 times as many, but it simply wasn't resourced. £80,000 for a Javelin missile. There you go.
Jack, you've investigated both these wars, Iraq and Afghanistan. Is it really as bad as the Small Wars Journal make out, that actually Britain's political and military strength in the world is the level that America doesn't want to go to war with us?
I think it's more that Obama doesn't want to go to war is the fundamental truth. I mean, if you speak to, there's a particular generation, as it were, of officers who had experience of Iraq and Basra, which has left a scar, and it has become a byword for British military incompetence. And it's hard to imagine the difference between the UK, how they were seen in 2002 as the pacifiers of Northern Ireland, and this rich history of counterinsurgency warfare, and where we stand now. But that's also a reappraisement that has taken place within the US military of their own capabilities. So I think I think there will be future conflicts into which we will plough without due diligence and due care, unfortunately, because the US has got a similar program to the one Mike was talking about, which is it was called the HANDS program, set up by McChrystal, to try and also train US soldiers, and all of these skills that's falling by the wayside. It's no one wants to be associated with the Afghan war now, like the Iraq war before it, and there's a strong desire to forget. And as Richard Dannett said, get back to training.
2 seconds. The UK military for that role has now taken language out of it, so you become an expert on a country without speaking the language. It's a joke.
General,
every subunit commander has to have a language now before they can be a company commander. So that's now come through as policy. So it's changing at the moment.
General, an army that hadn't lost a war for 200 years lost 2 in 10. I mean, I've heard officers.
That's your words, not mine.
No, I've heard serving officers saying that. Is it as bad as that?
I think our confidence has certainly taken a knock, and probably quite rightly. But equally, I think my own sense is that too much criticism has been lumped on the MOD for reasons I said earlier. If you are in a government, if you're trying to put lipstick on a pig, the military operation doesn't happen in isolation. If the political plan is not there, if the political ideals are just way beyond the art of the possible, then you're stuck with a very real problem when you're stuck in an organisation like that. You can either be right in your views, in which case you're irrelevant as far as the organisation is concerned, or you can accept that you're working within a flawed machine and you do the best you can to trim the sails within a flawed culture. And that's, unfortunately, if you're stuck with a messianic political class, where you're either with us or against us, and if you're going to be on the project, then you're on the project and you buy into it, and if you're not, you're just an enemy, then it's a very difficult challenge. And a lot of people compromise themselves doing the best they could because they realise that was, if you were part of the machine, that you were compromised.
Is Whitehall so broken that generals can't actually speak, as it were, truth to power?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. If you look at what David Richards was trying to do, he advised against going into Libya, and what did we do? We went into Libya and look what's happened. He said, where's the strategy? And because Whitehall doesn't understand the word strategy, not only can he not do strategy, he doesn't even know what it is. And that's true from records of various parliamentary committees who've investigated this question. The view in number 10 was that the military were just being obstructive by insisting on certain methodological processes that were slowing down the campaign they wanted to achieve. I've written all about this in a book, by the way. Just so you know.
We'll do that bit in a minute.
Sorry, my final comment on that. No, the short-termism is this. The short-termism is what the government have been trying to do, because of their historical ignorance, is achieve cultural change on a management consultant's time frame, and there you go.
Quite a concise book, I might say, compared to some of the others on offer tonight. But it's a word to the only Afghan on the panel. I mean, the question from here was that we've expected too much. I mean, 14 years isn't that long, and that you've come a long way, which you said some of that earlier on. But do you fear that the international community will move out completely, and that both in military and aid terms you'll be left on your own?
I completely agree with the short-termism. That's the problem. In 2006 I was in Milan. Somebody asked me in Afghanistan, are people allowed to convert from Islam to Christianity? I said no. He said, oh, we spend so much money in Afghanistan, that's a shame. So that is a high expectation, but the high expectation, I think, in the international conferences are also good, because especially when you're dealing with a laid-back Afghan government, it pushes them to do certain things, even if it requires them to write more creative reports, but at least they should do something. But back to your point, David, I think well, firstly, I appreciate your honesty, but I think some of the words that you say are based on misinformation. And again, it's because British public view the Afghanistan campaign purely from a military perspective, and also mostly focus on Helmand when they talk about it. But, I would have loved that history started from now, that you lived in Britain, I lived in Afghanistan, that the Scottish people had their country, Welsh their own, HSBC didn't have a branch in Geneva, or the Americans didn't owe billions of dollars to China. But unfortunately, that's not true. We live in a world of interconnectedness. Here, things that happen in Libya, in Afghanistan, in Syria affect Londoners here. So please do not stop your aid. I think in Afghanistan it has done tremendously good job. Please continue.
Well, I will take away from this evening my favourite comment of yours, which was Afghans don't like making predictions, particularly about the future. All of the books of members of the panel, apart from an excellent history of Afghanistan called Butcher and Bolt, it does not appear to be on the table, but all of the books recently out by members of the panel are available for sale tonight. And thank you very much for coming. It's been a wonderful evening. We'll go on.